The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood by the window of her private chambers. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Outside, the grounds were unusually quiet, as if the very earth understood the weight of what was coming. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing through memories, conversations, and the impossible decision that had brought her to this moment. William entered the room quietly, his footsteps soft against the carpet. Even after all these years of marriage, Catherine could read every emotion on his face. Today, his expression carried a mixture of determination and deep sadness that made her heart ache. He moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers in that familiar gesture of solidarity that had seen them through countless challenges. They stood together in silence, watching the world outside continue its normal rhythm, unaware that everything was about to change. The decision had not come easily. For months they had wrestled with it privately, keeping their struggles hidden behind the polished facade that royal life demanded. Late-night conversations in their private quarters had stretched into early morning hours. They had weighed every option, considered every consequence, and consulted with only their most trusted confidants. The pressure had been immense, coming from all directions, from tradition, from duty, from family expectations, and from their own sense of responsibility to the nation. Catherine thought back to the moment when everything had shifted. It was during a routine engagement at a children's hospital in London. She had been reading to a young patient, a girl of about 7 with bright eyes despite her illness. The child had looked up at Catherine and asked a simple question that cut through all the royal protocol and formality. The innocence of that question had struck something deep within her, making her realize that the path they were on was no longer sustainable. That evening, she had shared the encounter with William, and they both knew that they could not continue to ignore what their hearts were telling them. The pressures of royal life had always been intense, but recent years had brought challenges that neither of them had anticipated. The constant scrutiny, the relentless media attention, the constraints on their children's lives, all of it had begun to feel like a cage growing smaller each day. They had tried to adapt, to find ways to modernize their roles while respecting tradition. They had launched initiatives, championed causes, and worked tirelessly to serve the nation. But somewhere along the way, they had begun to lose themselves. William had been particularly affected by the weight of his future role. Since childhood, he had known what awaited him, but knowing something intellectually and living with its reality were two different things. He had watched his father navigate the complexities of royal duty for decades, seen the toll it had taken. He had witnessed his mother's struggles with the constraints of palace life, and how those struggles had ultimately contributed to tragedy. The ghosts of the past haunted the corridors of every royal residence, reminding him of the price that came with the crown. For Catherine, the journey had been different but equally challenging. She had entered the royal family as an outsider, a commoner who had captured the heart of a future king. The world had watched her transformation from a university student to a princess, analyzing every outfit choice, every public appearance, every word she spoke. She had handled it all with grace and dignity, becoming one of the most beloved members of the royal family. But that love came with expectations that grew heavier with each passing year. Their children had become the catalyst for their decision. George, Charlotte, and Louis were growing up in a world where their every move was documented, where their futures were predetermined, where privacy was a luxury they would never fully experience. As parents, William and Catherine had watched their children navigate this reality, and it had broken their hearts in ways they had not expected. They wanted their children to have choices, to discover their own paths, to experience childhood without the weight of destiny pressing down on their small shoulders. The conversation with the king had been the most difficult moment of the entire process. William had requested a private audience with his father, and they had met in one of the smaller drawing rooms at Buckingham Palace. The meeting had lasted for hours, voices rising and falling, emotions running high. Charles had been shocked, then angry, then desperately sad. He had tried to reason with his son, to remind him of duty and tradition, of the centuries of monarchy that had come before them. But William had stood firm, explaining their reasons with a clarity that came from months of soul-searching. Catherine had her own difficult conversations to navigate. The queen consort had reached out to her, woman to woman, trying to understand the decision that seemed to go against everything the royal family represented. Catherine had been honest about the struggles they had faced, about the toll on their mental health, about their fears for their children's future. She had expected judgment but had found instead a surprising measure of understanding, even if disagreement remained. The media had begun to sense that something was brewing. Tabloid headlines speculated about tensions within the palace walls, about disagreements over royal duties, about the future of the monarchy itself. Palace officials had worked overtime to manage the narrative, issuing carefully worded statements that said everything and nothing at once. But William and Catherine knew that they could not hide their decision forever. Soon, very soon, they would have to face the public and explain the choice that would change everything. As they stood together by the window that morning, Catherine leaned her head against William's shoulder. They had come so far together, from their university days at St. Andrews to this moment that would define the rest of their lives. Whatever came next, they would face it together as they always had. The love that had sustained them through the pressures of royal life would now carry them into an uncertain future. Outside the window, the sun continued to rise, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the castle walls. Soon, the world would know their decision, and nothing would ever be the same again. The palace staff had noticed the change in atmosphere over the previous weeks. Footmen and housekeepers who had served the royal family for decades could sense when something significant was happening, even when no official word had been given. They moved through the corridors with an extra measure of discretion, their usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. In the kitchens and service quarters, speculation ran wild, but no one dared to speak openly about what they suspected might be coming. Catherine had begun the difficult task of saying private goodbyes to people who had become more than just staff members over the years. There was Margaret, her personal secretary, who had been with her since the early days of her marriage. They had worked together through countless royal tours, charitable initiatives, and personal milestones. When Catherine had asked Margaret to join her for tea one afternoon, the older woman had known immediately that something was wrong. The conversation that followed had been emotional, with Catherine struggling to find the right words to explain a decision that she knew would be difficult for others to understand. William had his own farewells to manage. His private secretary, who had served him with unwavering loyalty for over a decade, had taken the news with stoic professionalism that barely masked his deep disappointment. They had been through so much together, navigating the complex world of royal protocol, managing crises, celebrating triumphs. To learn that it was all coming to an end had shaken the man to his core, though he had maintained his composure throughout their conversation. The couple had decided to tell their children before making any public announcement. George, as the eldest, had understood more than his younger siblings. At 12 years old, he was already aware of what his position meant, of the future that had been planned for him since birth. When his parents sat him down in the family's private sitting room and explained what they were about to do, his reaction had been complex. There was relief, certainly, at the idea of a more normal life, but there was also confusion and a sense of loss for an identity he had grown accustomed to carrying. Charlotte, at 10, had surprised them with her emotional intelligence. She had asked thoughtful questions about what their decision would mean for their family, for the people who depended on them, for the causes they had championed. Her maturity in that moment had both impressed and saddened her parents, a reminder that royal children were forced to grow up faster than their peers. Louis, still young enough to not fully grasp the implications, had been more concerned about whether they would still get to see his cousins and if they would have to move away from his friends. The logistics of their decision had proven incredibly complex. There were properties to consider, staff to be reassigned, security arrangements to be reworked, and financial matters to be untangled from the intricate web of royal funding. Teams of lawyers and advisors had been working behind closed doors for weeks, trying to create a framework for a situation that had few precedents in modern times. Every detail had to be considered, every contingency planned for, every possible consequence anticipated. William had spent hours in meetings with palace officials, working through the practical aspects of their transition. There were questions about their titles, their roles in official events, their relationship with various charities and organizations they had patronized. Some officials had been supportive, understanding that the modern world required different approaches to royal duty. Others had been coldly formal, seeing the decision as a betrayal of everything the monarchy represented. The tension in these meetings had been palpable, with centuries of tradition clashing against contemporary needs and personal well-being. Catherine had focused much of her energy on ensuring continuity for the charitable causes she had championed. Mental health advocacy, early childhood development, addiction support, these initiatives had been close to her heart, and she was determined to find ways to continue supporting them, even as she stepped back from official royal duties. She had held meetings with charity leaders, reassuring them of her continued commitment while being honest about the changes that would come. Many had been understanding, while others struggled to hide their disappointment at losing royal patronage. The couple had also had to consider the impact on the wider royal family. Harry and Meghan's departure years earlier had already created fault lines within the institution, and this new decision threatened to deepen those divisions. There were family members who saw William and Catherine's choice as validating Harry and Meghan's earlier complaints about royal life, while others viewed it as an entirely different situation. Family dinners had become tense affairs, with certain topics carefully avoided even as everyone knew what was really on everyone's minds. Prince George had asked his father a question one evening that had stayed with William for days afterward. They had been playing chess in the nursery, a quiet moment of normalcy amid the chaos of transition planning. George had moved his knight carefully, then looked up at his father and asked if this meant he would never be king. The question had been asked with such innocence, such genuine curiosity rather than distress, that William had felt his decision validated in that moment. He had explained that the future was open now, that George would have choices that William himself had never been given. The public announcement was being carefully crafted by communications teams. Every word was being debated, every phrase analyzed for potential misinterpretation. The palace wanted to control the narrative, to present the decision in a way that minimized damage to the monarchy while respecting William and Catherine's autonomy. It was a nearly impossible balance to strike, and tensions ran high during the drafting process. William and Catherine insisted on certain points being included, while palace officials pushed back on language they deemed too critical of the institution. Catherine had begun to dream about life after the announcement. In her quiet moments, she allowed herself to imagine walking through a grocery store without a security detail, taking the children to a park without photographers tracking their every move, making decisions about their family's schedule without consulting multiple layers of palace bureaucracy. These dreams felt both thrilling and terrifying, offering freedom but also uncertainty. She and William had lived their entire adult lives within the structure of royal duty, and stepping outside that structure meant venturing into unknown territory. The couple had received messages of support from unexpected quarters. Former staff members, distant relatives, and even some members of other royal families had reached out privately to express understanding and solidarity. These messages had meant more than they could express, providing reassurance that they were not completely alone in their decision. At the same time, they had also felt the cold shoulder from others who viewed their choice as selfish and destructive. As the day of the announcement drew closer, William found himself walking through the palace corridors late at night, unable to sleep. He paused before portraits of his ancestors, kings and queens who had carried the weight of the crown throughout British history. He wondered what they would think of his decision, whether they would see it as weakness or courage. But then he thought of his children sleeping peacefully in their rooms, and he knew that whatever judgment history might pass, he was making the right choice for his family. The morning of the announcement arrived with heavy gray clouds hanging low over London. Catherine woke early, her stomach twisted with anxiety despite the certainty she felt about their decision. She went through her morning routine mechanically, choosing her outfit with unusual care. Even in stepping back, she knew the world would analyze what she wore, searching for hidden meanings in every choice. She settled on something simple and elegant, appropriate for the gravity of the moment without being overly formal. William had barely slept. He had spent much of the night revising his statement, crossing out words and adding others, trying to capture the complexity of their feelings in language that would resonate with the public. His communications team had crafted a perfectly diplomatic version, but William felt it lacked authenticity. He wanted people to understand that this was not a rejection of Britain or its people, but rather a necessary step to protect what mattered most to him and Catherine. Finding that balance in words proved nearly impossible. The children had been kept home from school, though they did not fully understand why. The palace had decided it would be better for them to be with their parents when the news broke, rather than hearing about it secondhand or seeing their classmates' reactions. A team of advisors had been brought in to help prepare George, Charlotte, and Louis for the media storm that would inevitably follow. The children sat together in their playroom, trying to focus on games and books while sensing the tension that filled every room of the residence. At Buckingham Palace, King Charles sat in his study, staring at a copy of the statement that would soon be released to the press. His aides had urged him to issue his own statement, something that would demonstrate unity and support despite the difficult circumstances. But Charles struggled with the words, torn between his role as father and his duty as monarch. He had lived his entire life preparing for the throne, and the idea that his son was voluntarily stepping away from the line of succession felt like a personal failure, even though he understood intellectually that William's choice was about different priorities. The press office had organized a carefully orchestrated release plan. The statement would go out simultaneously to all major news outlets at exactly noon. This would prevent any single organization from claiming an exclusive, and it would ensure that the palace's version of events reached the public before speculation and rumor could dominate the narrative. Press officers sat ready at their computers, fingers hovering over send buttons, waiting for the signal to unleash news that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Catherine sat with William in their private sitting room as the final minutes ticked away. They held hands, drawing strength from each other as they had done countless times before. The enormity of what they were about to do washed over them in waves. There would be no going back after this. Once the statement was released, their lives would change irrevocably. They would face criticism, judgment, and perhaps even hostility from those who believed they were abandoning their duty. But they would also gain something precious that had been slipping away from them for years, the freedom to live authentically. At precisely noon, the statement hit news wires across the world. Phones began buzzing in newsrooms from London to New York to Sydney. Editors scrambled to read the words that would reshape their afternoon editions. Television producers interrupted regular programming with breaking news banners. Social media exploded with reactions before most people had even finished reading the full statement. The carefully chosen words that William and Catherine had labored over were now subject to instant analysis, interpretation, and debate by millions of people. The statement itself was thoughtful and heartfelt, explaining their decision without pointing fingers or expressing bitterness. They spoke of the honor they felt in serving the nation, of the deep respect they held for the monarchy, and of the impossible weight of trying to be perfect role models while also being human beings with vulnerabilities and needs. They mentioned their children, expressing their desire to give George, Charlotte, and Louis opportunities for a more normal childhood. They pledged continued support for the causes they cared about, though in a different capacity, and they asked for understanding and privacy as they navigated this transition. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some people expressed support, sharing their own stories of choosing well-being over societal expectations. They praised William and Catherine for prioritizing their mental health and their children's needs. Social media posts celebrated their courage to make such a difficult choice in the face of enormous pressure. Mental health advocates pointed to the decision as an important moment in normalizing conversations about stress, burnout, and the importance of setting boundaries even when it disappoints others. But the criticism was equally swift and harsh. Many people felt betrayed, arguing that William and Catherine had enjoyed the privileges of royal life and now wanted to abandon the responsibilities that came with those privileges. Newspaper columnists wrote scathing pieces about duty and obligation, comparing William unfavorably to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had served faithfully until her death. Social media trolls attacked Catherine, calling her manipulative and accusing her of pulling William away from his destiny. The hashtags that began trending ranged from supportive to viciously cruel. The British tabloids went into overdrive. Front pages screamed dramatic headlines, some sympathetic but most sensational. Reporters and photographers descended on every location connected to William and Catherine, hoping to capture exclusive images or quotes. Royal experts were pulled into television studios to provide analysis, their opinions varying wildly depending on their personal views of the monarchy. Some defended the couple's right to choose their own path, while others condemned them as selfish and weak. Inside the palace walls, the mood was somber. Staff members went about their duties quietly, unsure of what this meant for their own futures. Some positions would become redundant as William and Catherine's household was dismantled. Security details would need to be reconfigured. Schedules that had been planned months in advance would need to be canceled or reassigned. The machinery of royal life, which had run smoothly for so long, was suddenly grinding against unexpected obstacles. Catherine's mother, Carol Middleton, arrived at the residence that afternoon. She had been aware of the decision for some time, and though she had concerns about the backlash her daughter would face, she supported Catherine and William wholeheartedly. She found Catherine in the nursery with the children, trying to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy despite the chaos erupting in the world outside. Carol's presence provided comfort, a reminder that family support extended beyond titles and positions. William spoke with his brother Harry by phone later that day. The conversation was complex, colored by their own complicated history. Harry understood better than most what William and Catherine were going through, having made his own difficult choice years earlier. But there was also tension, an unspoken question about whether William's decision somehow validated Harry's earlier departure, or whether it was fundamentally different. They spoke for nearly an hour, finding some common ground even as certain subjects remained too painful to fully explore. The palace released a brief statement from King Charles, expressing love for his son and daughter-in-law, while reaffirming his commitment to the crown. It was carefully worded to avoid either endorsing or condemning their decision, walking a diplomatic tightrope that satisfied no one completely. Buckingham Palace staff immediately began working on plans to redistribute royal duties, determining how the gap left by William and Catherine would be filled. The logistics were complicated, made more so by the reduced number of working royals available to take on additional responsibilities. As evening fell, William and Catherine watched news coverage of their announcement. Seeing their faces splashed across every channel, commentators debated their motives, their character, and the implications for the future of the monarchy. It was surreal to watch strangers discuss the most personal aspects of their lives with such confidence and authority. Catherine felt William's hand tighten around hers as a particularly harsh critic questioned whether they had ever truly cared about their duty to the nation. That night, after the children were finally asleep, William and Catherine stood together on their private terrace, looking out over the grounds. The media vans and cameras that had gathered outside the gates were visible in the distance, their lights cutting through the darkness. The attention would not fade quickly, they both knew. This was just the beginning of a long, difficult period of transition, but as they stood together in the quiet of the evening, they felt something they had not felt in a long time. They felt free. The days following the announcement blurred together in an exhausting marathon of meetings, phone calls, and difficult conversations. William and Catherine found themselves navigating a complex web of legal, financial, and protocol issues that no one had fully anticipated. The palace lawyers worked around the clock to establish precedents for a situation that had few historical comparisons. Every decision seemed to trigger a cascade of additional complications that needed to be addressed before they could move forward. The question of their titles became a major point of contention. Some palace officials argued that stepping back from royal duties should mean relinquishing their titles entirely. Others believed they should retain ceremonial titles, but without the official responsibilities. William and Catherine had their own thoughts on the matter. Feeling that their identities were intertwined with these names they had carried for so long, yet not wanting to appear to be clinging to status while abandoning obligation. The negotiations stretched on for days with no easy resolution in sight. Their children's schools had become focal points for media attention, despite palace efforts to maintain privacy for the young royals. Photographers camped outside the gates hoping to capture images of George, Charlotte, and Louis arriving or departing. Other parents at the school had mixed reactions, some supportive and others concerned about the disruption to their own children's education. The school administration worked with security teams to establish new protocols, but the increased attention was impossible to ignore. Catherine had begun the painful process of resigning from her patronages. Each organization held special meaning for her, representing years of work and personal connection. She met individually with leaders of her key charities, explaining that while she was stepping back from official royal duties, her commitment to their causes remained unchanged. Some were understanding, recognizing that her support could continue in different ways. Others struggled to hide their disappointment, knowing that losing royal patronage meant losing significant publicity and fundraising advantages. The mental health organization that Catherine had championed for years held particular significance. She had shared her own struggles with anxiety and the challenges of life in the public eye, helping to reduce stigma around mental health issues. When she met with the organization's director to discuss the transition, the conversation became emotional. They spoke honestly about the irony that Catherine's decision to prioritize her own mental health might mean stepping away from public mental health advocacy. Eventually, they found ways for Catherine to continue supporting the work behind the scenes, lending her voice when appropriate without the formal structure of royal patronage. William faced similar challenges with his environmental and conservation work. For years, he had used his platform to advocate for urgent action on climate change and wildlife protection. The causes felt more important than ever, and walking away from the public stage troubled him deeply. He met with conservation leaders across several days, brainstorming ways to maintain his involvement and influence without the formal backing of his royal position. Some suggested he could be even more effective without palace constraints, free to take stronger stances on controversial issues. The financial discussions proved particularly complex. William and Catherine had lived within a system where their expenses were covered by various royal funding mechanisms, but they had never received traditional salaries. Now they needed to establish financial independence, determining how they would support themselves and their family without royal funding. They had some personal wealth, inheritance from Diana and family trusts, but nothing approaching what would be required to maintain security and appropriate housing for their family. Financial advisors presented various options, from philanthropic work to private sector consulting, each possibility requiring careful consideration of how it might be perceived publicly. Security remained one of the most serious concerns. Even stepping back from royal duties, William and Catherine would remain high-profile targets for potential threats. The couple wanted to reduce their security footprint, hoping for more privacy and normalcy, but security experts made clear that certain protections were non-negotiable. Threat assessments were conducted, vulnerabilities identified, and new protocols established. The cost of maintaining appropriate security would be substantial, adding another layer to their financial considerations. The couple had made the difficult decision to move from their current residence. Kensington Palace held countless memories, both joyful and challenging, but it was too closely tied to their royal roles. They needed a fresh start, a place that felt like it belonged to them rather than to the institution. The search for a new home proved complicated, needing to balance their desire for normalcy with practical requirements for security and space. Every property they considered would immediately become a focus of public attention once their residence there became known. Public opinion continued to evolve as more details of their decision emerged. Some of the initial harsh criticism softened as people learned more about the pressures William and Catherine had faced. Interviews with royal insiders speaking anonymously painted a picture of a couple who had tried desperately to make their royal roles work, before reaching the conclusion that their situation was unsustainable. These revelations prompted more nuanced discussions about the future of the monarchy and whether the institution needed fundamental reform to remain relevant in the modern world. However, a significant portion of the British public remained deeply upset by the decision. To them, William's choice to step back from the line of succession represented an abandonment of a sacred duty that transcended personal happiness. Letters poured into the palace, some supportive but many expressing anger and disappointment. William read several of these letters, feeling the weight of having let down people who had invested their hopes and expectations in him. The criticism stung precisely because he understood it, even as he remained convinced that his decision was necessary. The broader royal family struggled to present a united front. Some members, particularly those who had devoted their entire lives to royal service, found William and Catherine's decision incomprehensible. Others, especially younger members of the family, privately expressed understanding and even envy at their courage to choose a different path. Family gatherings became tense affairs, with careful conversation that avoided addressing the obvious elephant in the room. The fissures within the family that had already existed were widened by this latest controversy. Catherine's relationship with Camilla, the queen consort, became unexpectedly important during this transition. Camilla had her own complicated history with the royal family, having faced years of public criticism before eventually winning acceptance. She reached out to Catherine with genuine empathy, recognizing some parallels in their experiences of being judged harshly by those who did not know the full story. Their conversations provided Catherine with valuable perspective and unexpected support from someone who understood the complexity of royal life in ways few others could. George had begun asking more questions about what their new life would look like. His parents tried to answer honestly while being age-appropriate, explaining that things would be different but that their family would remain strong and together. George worried about his friends, about his school, about the activities he enjoyed. Charlotte, meanwhile, had become quieter than usual, processing the changes in her own way. Louis, still young enough to adapt more easily, seemed less troubled by the uncertainty, focused more on the immediate aspects of his daily life than on abstract concepts of royal duty and public perception. The palace had begun formally redistributing the duties that William and Catherine had carried. Other family members would take on additional patronages and royal engagements. The calendar of events was being reorganized, with some occasions being eliminated entirely and others being reassigned. Palace staff worked to ensure continuity and minimize disruption, but the practical reality was that there were simply fewer working royals available to cover an already demanding schedule of obligations. William had a particularly difficult conversation with his father about the coronation regalia and ceremonial roles that would need to be adjusted. Traditions dating back centuries were being rewritten because of their decision. Charles struggled to maintain composure during this conversation, the weight of history pressing down on both of them. They were changing things that had remained consistent through world wars, social upheaval, and technological revolution. The magnitude of what they were altering was not lost on either man. As the first week after the announcement drew to a close, William and Catherine took a private moment together in their garden. Away from advisors, staff, and family pressures, they could simply be themselves. Catherine asked William if he had any regrets. He took time to consider the question seriously before answering. He acknowledged the pain of disappointing people, the sadness of stepping away from meaningful work, and the uncertainty of their future. But when he looked at Catherine and thought of their children, he knew that despite all the difficulties they now faced, they had made the only choice they could live with. The path forward remained unclear, but at least it was a path they were choosing for themselves. 3 weeks had passed since the announcement, and the initial media frenzy had begun to settle into a different kind of sustained attention. William and Catherine found themselves living in a strange liminal space, no longer fully royal but not yet completely private citizens. Every step they took was analyzed, every decision scrutinized for what it might reveal about their state of mind or their future plans. They had hoped that stepping back would bring relief, but the transition period brought its own unique pressures. The formal negotiations about their exit from royal duties had reached a critical phase. Teams of lawyers, financial advisors, and palace officials gathered in conference rooms day after day, working through the unprecedented complexities of their situation. Questions arose that no one had considered before. What happened to the charities they had founded or co-founded? Who would take over their military appointments? How would their staff be reassigned or compensated? Each answer generated new questions, creating a seemingly endless chain of issues that required resolution. Catherine had started therapy to help process the enormous changes in her life. She had been a vocal advocate for mental health support, but actually seeking help for herself felt different. The therapist she chose specialized in life transitions and identity issues, understanding that Catherine was not just changing jobs but fundamentally reimagining who she was beyond the role she had inhabited for over a decade. In their sessions, Catherine explored feelings of guilt, relief, fear, and hope that often competed with each other in bewildering ways. The couple had found a property that might become their new home. It was in the countryside, far enough from London to provide genuine privacy but close enough to remain accessible for the children's schooling and their ongoing commitments. The house itself was substantial but not palatial, with grounds that could be properly secured without the fortress-like presence that had surrounded their royal residences. They had walked through the empty rooms together, imagining their furniture placed here and there, picturing their children running through the halls, trying to envision a life that felt simultaneously foreign and hopeful. William had received an unexpected letter from his grandmother's former private secretary. The elderly gentleman, now retired, had written to share his thoughts on William's decision. Contrary to what William had feared, the letter was not condemning. Instead, it spoke of Queen Elizabeth II's own struggles with duty, of moments when she too had felt the weight of the crown almost unbearable. He suggested that the Queen would have understood William's choice, even if she might not have been able to make it herself. The letter had moved William deeply, offering a bridge between the past he was leaving and the future he was creating. The children's adjustment had been uneven. George had experienced some bullying at school from classmates who repeated their parents' criticisms of William and Catherine's decision. He had come home in tears one afternoon, confused about why people he thought were friends had turned against him. The school had intervened, but the damage to George's sense of security had been done. William and Catherine had spent a long evening talking with him, trying to explain that people often reacted with anger when they felt confused or threatened by change. George had asked if they were doing the wrong thing, and William had felt his heart break at the question. Charlotte had found her own way to process the changes. She had started writing stories, elaborate tales of princesses who gave up their crowns to have adventures in the regular world. Catherine had found one of these stories on Charlotte's desk and read it with tears in her eyes. The princess in Charlotte's story faced dragons and trolls who tried to make her return to her castle, but she persisted in her quest for freedom because she knew it was right for her kingdom and her family. The child's creative processing of their situation was both heartbreaking and inspiring. A major television network had approached William and Catherine about doing a formal interview to explain their decision in their own words. The offer was tempting, an opportunity to control the narrative and share their perspective without the filter of tabloid interpretation. But they worried about the risks. Every word would be dissected, every expression analyzed. They could inadvertently say something that would be turned against them, or that would damage the monarchy further. After days of discussion with advisors and with each other, they declined the interview, choosing instead to let their actions speak for themselves. The palace had scheduled one final official engagement for William and Catherine before their formal transition was complete. It would be a charity event for an organization they had both supported, an opportunity to say a public goodbye while highlighting a cause they cared about. The planning for this event became enormously complicated, with every detail requiring approval from multiple parties. What they would wear, what they would say, who they would meet. All of it was choreographed with the precision of a military operation. Financial reality had begun to set in. William and Catherine had been forced to accept that maintaining their current lifestyle without royal funding was simply impossible. Difficult decisions loomed about staff reductions, selling certain assets, and fundamentally rethinking their approach to daily life. Catherine had begun researching how other former royals had managed similar transitions, learning from their successes and mistakes. The idea of William taking on some form of employment was discussed, though what that might look like remained unclear. The couple had reconnected with old friends from their university days, people who had known them before the weight of royal duty had settled onto their shoulders. These friendships, somewhat dormant during the intense years of royal service, now felt like lifelines to a simpler time. Catherine had coffee with a former roommate who now worked as a teacher in Scotland. The conversation was refreshingly normal, discussing children's homework struggles and weekend plans rather than state dinners and diplomatic protocols. It reminded Catherine of who she had been before becoming a princess, and who she might become again. William had taken up running again, something he had not done regularly in years. In the early mornings, with his security detail trailing at a discreet distance, he would run through the countryside near their residence. The physical exertion helped clear his mind, and the solitude gave him rare moments to think without someone needing his attention or opinion. During these runs, he processed his feelings about the dramatic changes in his life, working through grief for what he was leaving behind and anxiety about what lay ahead. The relationship between William and his father remained strained, but was slowly improving. Charles had begun to understand, if not fully accept, that his son's decision came from a place of genuine need rather than rejection. They had started having weekly phone calls, carefully avoiding the most painful topics but gradually rebuilding trust. Charles shared stories about his own struggles with royal life, moments of doubt that William had never known his father experienced. These conversations revealed depths to their relationship that had been hidden beneath layers of formality and unspoken expectations. Catherine had made a private visit to a women's shelter that she had supported during her years as a working royal. She went without photographers or press announcements, simply showing up to spend time with the residents and staff. The director of the shelter had been moved to tears, explaining that many of the women there had found inspiration in Catherine's openness about mental health struggles. Catherine realized that she did not need a royal title to make a difference in individual lives. The visit reinforced her belief that meaningful work could continue outside the constraints of official duty. The couple had received communication from Harry and Meghan, who had offered practical advice based on their own experience of stepping away from royal life. The relationship between the brothers remained complicated, with years of hurt and misunderstanding still unresolved. But there was also recognition that they now shared a unique bond, having both chosen paths that defied family expectations. Meghan had spoken with Catherine by phone, offering solidarity and understanding that came from having lived through similar public criticism. The conversation had been healing in unexpected ways, creating space for future reconciliation even if the path remained uncertain. As William and Catherine prepared for their final official engagement, they spent an evening going through photo albums from their years of royal service. There were images from their wedding day, radiant and full of hope. Pictures from royal tours across the globe, meeting people from countless cultures and backgrounds. Photographs of them with their children at official events, trying to balance parental warmth with royal protocol. Each image told a story of a life lived in service of moments both meaningful and exhausting. They felt proud of what they had accomplished even as they acknowledged that continuing on that path had become impossible. The night before their final engagement, Catherine could not sleep. She wandered through the residence, touching familiar objects and remembering moments associated with each room. This had been her home, the place where her children had taken their first steps, where family celebrations had unfolded, where private tears had fallen during the hardest times. Leaving it felt like leaving a part of herself behind. William found her in the nursery, standing by the window where she had rocked each of their babies to sleep. They held each other in the darkness, drawing strength from their partnership that had sustained them through everything. The morning of the final engagement arrived with unexpectedly beautiful weather. Sunshine broke through clouds that had hung over London for days, as if nature itself was acknowledging the significance of the occasion. Catherine dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that honored the formality of the event while reflecting her own personal style. William wore his military uniform for the last time in an official capacity, the medals and insignia carrying the weight of duty and sacrifice. They looked at each other before leaving their rooms, both recognizing that they were about to close one chapter of their lives forever. The venue was filled with people from various organizations they had supported over the years. Charity workers, volunteers, and beneficiaries of their patronage had gathered to acknowledge the contributions William and Catherine had made. As they entered the hall, the applause was genuine and warm, a recognition that transcended the controversy surrounding their decision. These were people who had worked alongside them, who understood the depth of their commitment even if they regretted that the formal relationship was ending. William delivered a speech that he had written himself, without input from palace communications teams. His words were honest and emotional, thanking everyone for their support and explaining that stepping back from royal duties did not mean stepping away from the values and causes they had championed. He spoke about the importance of mental health, of creating space for authentic living, and of the courage required to choose a different path when the expected one proves unsustainable. His voice cracked at moments, revealing the genuine emotion behind the carefully chosen words. Catherine spoke as well, her remarks focusing on gratitude and hope. She thanked the people who had welcomed her into the royal family and supported her through the challenging learning process of becoming a public figure. She acknowledged the privilege she had experienced and the responsibility that came with it. But she also spoke about the importance of being true to oneself, of modeling for her children that it was acceptable to reassess life choices when circumstances changed. Her words resonated with many in the audience who had faced their own difficult transitions. After the speeches, William and Catherine moved through the crowd, speaking personally with as many people as possible. They listened to stories of how their advocacy had made a difference in individual lives. They accepted thanks and good wishes, but also gentle criticisms from those who wished they had found a way to continue. Each conversation was a small goodbye, a recognition that these relationships built over years would now evolve into something different, or perhaps fade away entirely. The emotional toll of these farewells accumulated through the afternoon, leaving both of them exhausted. As the event concluded and they prepared to leave, Catherine turned back for one last look at the gathering. She saw people whose lives had been touched by their work, causes that had been elevated by their attention, connections that had been forged through their efforts. She felt simultaneously proud of what they had accomplished and sad that this phase was ending. William took her hand, and together they walked out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving behind the formal structures of royal duty, but carrying with them memories, relationships, and lessons that would shape whatever came next in their journey together. 6 months had passed since William and Catherine's final official engagement, and they had settled into a rhythm of life that felt both strange and liberating. The new house in the countryside had become home, its rooms filled with their furniture and the sounds of their children's laughter. The transition had been far from smooth, but they had navigated each challenge together, learning to live without the scaffolding of royal protocol that had supported and constrained them for so long. The children had adjusted in their own ways. George had transferred to a new school where his classmates knew him simply as George, rather than as a prince. The first few weeks had been difficult, with curious stares and whispered conversations, but eventually the novelty had worn off. He had made genuine friends, boys and girls who liked him for his sense of humor and kindness, rather than for his family connections. Catherine had cried the first time George had been invited to a birthday party at a local bowling alley, such an ordinary childhood experience that had previously been impossible. Charlotte had blossomed in unexpected ways. Without the constant pressure of public appearances and rigid schedules, she had discovered a passion for art. Her room was covered with paintings and drawings, colorful expressions of her inner world. Catherine had enrolled her in art classes at a community center, where Charlotte worked alongside other children without anyone treating her differently. The instructor had mentioned that Charlotte showed real talent, something that filled Catherine with pride that had nothing to do with royal achievements or public perception. Louis, the youngest, had adapted most easily to their new circumstances. He attended the local primary school and had become inseparable from a neighbor's son. The two boys could be found most afternoons riding bikes through the lanes near their home, security following at enough distance to give them a sense of freedom. Louis barely remembered the intensity of their royal life, and William felt grateful that his youngest child would grow up with fewer burdens of expectation. William had found purpose in unexpected places. He had accepted a position with a conservation organization, working behind the scenes on policy and strategy, rather than as a public figurehead. The work was demanding and meaningful, allowing him to contribute his expertise without the constant scrutiny that had accompanied his royal environmental advocacy. His colleagues treated him as an equal, challenging his ideas and expecting him to pull his weight. The normalcy of having a job with real responsibilities and accountability felt oddly satisfying. Catherine had continued her work in mental health and early childhood development, but on her own terms. She had established a small foundation with private funding, creating programs that made real differences in individual lives rather than serving primarily as photo opportunities. Without the palace machinery managing every detail, she found she could be more responsive and innovative, trying approaches that might have been deemed too risky or unconventional for a working royal. The freedom to fail, paradoxically, had made her more willing to take chances that sometimes led to remarkable successes. Their financial situation had stabilized after some difficult adjustments. They lived comfortably but not extravagantly, having sold properties and downsized staff to match their reduced circumstances. William had struggled initially with managing household bills and making budget decisions, practical skills he had never needed to develop in his previous life. Catherine had adapted more easily, drawing on her pre-royal experience and actually finding satisfaction in the independence that came with financial self-sufficiency. The relationship with the wider royal family remained complicated. Some members had warmed to William and Catherine over time, while others maintained a cool distance. The king had visited them twice at their new home, awkward visits where everyone tried too hard to act normal. But gradually, through these uncomfortable encounters, Charles and William were rebuilding their bond. They would never fully understand each other's choices, but they were learning to accept that understanding was not always necessary for love. Harry had visited with his family, and the reunion between the brothers had been emotional. They had walked together through the countryside, talking honestly for hours about the choices they had both made, and the pain those choices had caused. There were apologies and explanations, acknowledgments of mistakes and expressions of hope for rebuilding trust. The relationship would never be what it once was. Too much had happened for that. But they found a new foundation, a recognition that they were both doing their best to protect their families while honoring different values and priorities. The British public's perception of William and Catherine had evolved significantly. The initial outrage had faded, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the pressures they had faced. Opinion polls showed that while some people still felt betrayed by their decision, a growing majority respected their choice to prioritize well-being over tradition. Younger generations in particular saw them as courageous role models who had defied outdated expectations to live authentically. The monarchy itself had become the subject of renewed debate, with William and Catherine's departure serving as a catalyst for discussions about institutional reform. The tabloids had eventually moved on to other stories, though William and Catherine still attracted occasional attention. They had learned to live with a degree of public interest while establishing firmer boundaries about privacy. Security teams had been reduced to more manageable levels, and they could sometimes venture out in public without causing significant disruption. Catherine had gone grocery shopping alone for the first time in over a decade, a mundane experience that had left her feeling empowered and slightly giddy with the ordinariness of it all. William had reconnected with his passion for flying, something that had been curtailed during his years as a working royal, due to security concerns and the need to avoid risky activities. He had begun volunteering with an air ambulance service, using his skills to help people in medical emergencies. The work was challenging and occasionally heartbreaking, but it gave him a sense of purpose that felt more immediate and tangible than many of his previous royal duties. Coming home after a shift where he had helped save someone's life reminded him why their decision had been necessary. Catherine had started writing a book about her experiences, not a tell-all memoir designed to settle scores, but rather a thoughtful reflection on identity, duty, and personal growth. She wrote in the early mornings before the children woke, processing the journey she had traveled from a girl growing up in Berkshire to a princess, and then to something harder to define but more authentically herself. The writing was therapeutic, helping her make sense of the complex emotions that still surfaced unexpectedly. The couple had established new traditions for their family, simple rituals that had nothing to do with royal protocol: Friday night pizza and movie nights, Saturday morning hikes in the nearby hills, Sunday afternoon board games with fierce but loving competition. These ordinary activities created memories that their children would carry forward, experiences of normalcy that had been largely absent from William's own childhood. Watching his children grow up with more freedom than he had known filled William with a contentment that surprised him with its depth. They had maintained friendships with a few carefully selected members of their former staff, people who had become genuine friends rather than merely employees. These relationships, now freed from the formality of the employer-employee dynamic, had deepened in meaningful ways. One former aide had become godmother to Louis, a role she took seriously and that brought her frequently to their home. These connections to their past life provided continuity and reminded them that not everything from their royal years needed to be left behind. The question of George's future came up occasionally in their household. He was next in line after William, though William's decision had complicated the succession in ways that constitutional experts were still debating. George himself seemed remarkably unconcerned. more interested in football scores and video games than in questions of destiny and duty. William and Catherine had agreed to let him grow up without the pressure of expectations, to make his own choices when the time came. They would support whatever path he chose, having learned the cost of following a predetermined road without question. On a quiet evening in late autumn, William and Catherine sat together on their back porch wrapped in blankets against the cooling air. The children were inside doing homework, their voices carrying through the open window and comforting ordinary sounds. They talked about their day, shared small observations and gentle jokes, comfortable in the companionship they had built over years of partnership. The peace they felt was hard-won, purchased at great cost and still fragile in moments when doubt crept in. Catherine asked William if he ever regretted their decision. He took time to consider, as he always did with important questions. He acknowledged missing aspects of their former life, the sense of historical continuity, the ability to effect change on a grand scale, the pride of representing something larger than himself. But when he balanced those losses against what they had gained, the authentic relationships, the freedom to make choices, the normalcy for their children, the answer remained clear. They had made the right choice for their family, even if it had been the hardest thing they had ever done. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the clear night sky, they sat in silence, hands intertwined. The journey that had begun with that difficult decision months ago continued to unfold in unexpected ways. There would be more challenges ahead, moments of doubt and difficulty that they could not yet anticipate, but they faced the future together, no longer bound by ancient expectations but guided by their own values and their love for each other. The goodbye they had said to their royal life had been filled with raw emotion, silencing critics and supporters alike with its honesty. Now they were writing a new story, one without precedent or prescribed ending, and that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. Britain had watched them leave one role behind, and now the world would watch them discover who they would become next.